That night, the 6-year-old boy didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't call out for his parents. After the accident took both his mother and father in a brutal snowstorm, he did something far more frightening. He went completely silent, not for days, not for weeks, but as if he had forgotten how to speak at all. In a cold, quiet house in the small town of Cedar Ridge, only 7 retired K9 dogs stayed close to him. They didn't bark. They didn't push. They simply lay around the boy like a living shield. Until the day adults decided the dogs had to be taken away. That was when the boy walked straight into the storm. And what those 7 K9 dogs did next would leave an entire nation stunned. Evan Reed hadn't spoken a single word since the night the mountain took his parents. In Cedar Ridge, Montana, people still said "that storm" the way they said "that fire." Snow came down sideways, thick as flour in a wind. The pass closed early, but Tyler and Amanda Reed still tried to make it home. They'd called before they lost signal, promising their 6-year-old they'd be back for bedtime. Evan waited by the living room window, forehead on the cold glass, watching the porch light halo the falling white. The call came after midnight. Uncle Mason answered because Evan had drifted off on the couch with the TV low. Mason listened, went pale, and sat down hard like his legs quit on him. When Grandma Ruth stepped in, towel in hand, Mason couldn't form a sentence. He just shook his head once. Ruth didn't scream. Her face simply went still, the way a lake goes still before it freezes. Morning arrived, bright and cruel. Adults moved through the house, voices muffled. Evan heard words he understood, but couldn't connect to anything real. Accident, whiteout, guardrail, no survivors. Someone touched his shoulder, and he flinched, not in fear, but like the touch came from a world he couldn't reach. They asked questions. "Do you want cereal?" "Sweetheart, talk to us." Evan looked at their mouths moving and felt nothing rise in him to answer. By afternoon, 7 German shepherds stood at the front door. A state trooper brought them, along with a woman from a rescue unit. The dogs were big, older, their muzzles silvered, their eyes steady. They didn't bark. They held themselves like professionals waiting for a job. Their tags were scuffed and familiar, the kind you see on dogs who have worked hard for a long time. "They were Tyler's retired K9s," the trooper told Mason softly. "Your brother and his wife were keeping them together." Mason nodded, throat tight. He'd handled K9s before his knee gave out and the nights got too loud. He knew what discipline looked like in a dog, and he saw it in all 7, even now, even in grief. Evan stood behind Ruth's skirt and stared. One shepherd stepped forward, older than the rest, moving with careful dignity. He lowered his head and pressed his forehead gently to Evan's knee. The touch was light, respectful, like a promise offered without demanding anything back. Evan didn't step away. His small hand rose, hesitant, then settled into the fur between the dog's ears. Ruth covered her mouth to keep from making a sound that might scare the moment away. After that, the dogs moved into the house as if they belonged there. One lay by the couch. One took the back door. 2 settled near Evan's hallway, quiet guardians with patient eyes. They weren't guarding the furniture. They were guarding the boy. Dinner came and went. Evan sat at the table with a plate in front of him and stared through it. Ruth coaxed him, voice soft as worn cloth. Mason tried to fill the silence with ordinary talk and couldn't. Tyler's chair sat empty. Amanda's mug still waited by the sink. The calendar on the wall stayed open, as if time had forgotten to turn the page. Later, when Ruth finally got Evan into bed, Mason stopped at the half-open door of Tyler's old office. Boxes sat stacked in a hurry. On top of one lay a small metal whistle on a braided cord, cold and dull in the lamplight. Tyler's K9 whistle. Mason picked it up, and the metal chilled his palm. A quiet shuffle sounded behind him. Evan stood in the doorway, barefoot in loose pajamas, eyes fixed on the whistle as if it were the only thing in the room that made sense. One of the shepherds stood behind him, silent as a shadow. Mason swallowed. "Buddy, you should be asleep." Evan didn't answer. He stepped forward and wrapped both hands around the cord. Mason let go. Evan gripped it too tightly, knuckles whitening. He brought the whistle to his lips and tried to blow. No sound came. He tried again, harder, and the metal edge scraped his mouth. A thin line of red appeared. Evan stared at it without expression, then clenched his fist until another bead of blood welled at the base of his thumb. Mason reached out, alarmed. "Evan, hey, easy! You're hurting yourself." Evan looked up at him, eyes flat and older than any 6-year-old's should be, and opened his mouth. Nothing came out. In the doorway, the other dogs had gathered, shoulder to shoulder, watching as if the room had turned into a mission site. The oldest shepherd pressed close to Evan's leg, steady and warm. Outside, the wind shoved snow against the windows. Inside, Evan held the whistle like the last thread tying him to the life he'd lost, and the silence in his throat felt deeper than the storm. Morning came thin and gray, the kind that made even the kitchen clock sound too loud. Evan sat on the floor with his back against the couch, knees pulled to his chest, the metal whistle resting in his lap. He hadn't slept. Every time his eyes closed, the house felt wrong, like it belonged to someone else. The 7 dogs had arranged themselves without being told. 2 lay near the front door, ears tilted toward the outside world. One rested by the back door, chin on his paws. Another settled near the hallway, close enough to Evan that his warm breath brushed the boy's pajama leg. The rest formed a loose half-circle around him, close but not crowding, as if they understood that space mattered now. Grandma Ruth watched from the kitchen doorway, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. She had raised children, buried friends, lived through lean years, but this quiet frightened her more than noise ever had. A child should cry. A child should rage. Evan did neither. She tried anyway. "Sweetheart," she said, keeping her voice steady, "how about some toast?" Evan didn't look up. His fingers traced the worn edge of the whistle cord, back and forth, like he was counting breaths he didn't quite trust. Ruth set the mug down and knelt, careful not to spook the dogs. One of them glanced at her, then back to Evan, not threatening, just watchful. Uncle Mason came in from the porch, snow dusting his shoulders. He'd been out early, checking the old furnace again, even though he already knew what it would tell him. Winter in Cedar Ridge didn't forgive hesitation, and fuel wasn't getting cheaper. "Power company called," he said quietly to Ruth. "We're behind." Ruth closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. "We'll manage." Mason nodded, but his gaze drifted to the dogs. 7 retired K9s meant food, vet care, permits. It meant paperwork and money they didn't have. He pushed the thought away for now. One crisis at a time. After breakfast went untouched, Mason tried something different. He rolled a tennis ball across the rug, gentle, slow. One of the shepherds lifted his head, tail thumping once. Another stood, stretched, then looked to Evan, waiting. "Hey, buddy," Mason said, crouching. "Want to throw it?" Evan didn't move, but when the dog nudged the ball toward him with his nose, Evan's hand lifted. He pushed it back. Not far. Just enough. The dog retrieved it and returned, careful not to drop it at Mason's feet. He placed it back near Evan's knee, eyes soft, patient. Something in Evan's shoulders loosened. Just a fraction. The other dogs noticed. They always did. By mid-morning there was a knock. It wasn't loud, but every dog rose at once. No barking, just bodies shifting, a quiet wall forming between Evan and the door. Mason felt his chest tighten. He recognized that posture. Alert, not aggressive, ready. He opened the door to find a woman in a county jacket and a man with a clipboard. Behind them stood Officer Dana Brooks, hat tucked under her arm, snow melting on her boots. "Morning," Dana said gently. "Mind if we come in?" The woman glanced past Mason, eyes flicking to the dogs. "We've had a report," she said. 7 large dogs in a residence with a minor." Mason stepped aside. "They're trained, retired K-9s." The man made a note. "We'll need documentation, vaccinations, special housing permit." Inside, Evan had gone very still. He sat where he was, eyes fixed on the floor. One of the shepherds pressed closer, flank warm against his side. Dana noticed. She always noticed things like that. "These dogs," she said, tone respectful. "They've worked search and rescue, haven't they?" Mason nodded. "My brother trained them, him and his wife." Dana's gaze softened. "I figured." The woman with the clipboard cleared her throat. "We'll schedule a full inspection. If the requirements aren't met, some of the dogs may need to be rehomed." The word hung in the air, sharp as ice. Evan's hand stopped moving. He didn't look up. He didn't cry. He simply leaned forward and wrapped both arms around the nearest dog's neck, holding on like the floor had tilted. The dog stayed perfectly still, absorbing the weight, accepting the fear without flinching. Ruth's breath hitched. Mason felt anger rise, hot and useless. Dana saw it all. She crouched slightly, keeping her voice low. "No decisions today," she said, more to Evan than anyone else. "We'll take this one step at a time." The woman nodded, already writing dates. 10 days. When the door finally closed, the house felt smaller. Evan didn't move from the floor. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into a basket by the door and pulled out 7 worn collars. One by one, he laid them in a straight line, buckles facing the same way, just like he'd seen his father do after training. Mason watched, heart breaking. Evan didn't say a word, but the message was clear enough that it hurt to look at. The 10 days did not begin with a countdown. They began with a silence that pressed in from all sides. Evan stopped going near the front windows. Each time a car slowed on the road, his shoulders lifted, tight as wire. The dogs noticed before anyone else did. They adjusted their positions without sound, placing their bodies where Evan could see them, not blocking him, anchoring him. Grandma Ruth spent her mornings at the kitchen table with envelopes spread out like a losing hand. Electric, heating fuel, vet clinics in 3 different towns. She circled numbers, crossed them out, circled them again. By noon her hands shook, and she would fold everything away before Evan wandered in and saw too much. Uncle Mason tried to keep the house running like a normal place. He fixed a loose hinge, shoveled snow, cooked meals that went mostly untouched. At night, when the dogs settled and Ruth finally slept, Mason sat at the table with his brother's old training logs. Names, dates. Notes written in Tyler's tight, careful hand. Proof that these dogs were more than pets. Proof that might not be enough. Officer Dana Brooks stopped by twice that week, not in uniform the second time. She brought coffee and a stack of printed forms. She spoke softly, asked permission before moving through the house. The dogs watched her, then accepted her, one by one. "These are good dogs," she said to Mason, low, enough that Evan wouldn't hear. "But good doesn't always win paperwork battles." The official knock came on the 7th day. It was firmer this time, confident. The sound carried down the hallway and into Evan's bones. He froze where he stood, one hand on the edge of the couch. The dogs rose in unison, a quiet line forming at his back. Mason opened the door to find the same county jacket, the same clipboard, and a new face. A woman in a dark coat, hair pinned tight, eyes sharp and assessing. "Marla Hensley," she said, offering a hand Mason didn't take. "Town council." Her gaze moved past him, counting. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 7. "This is a lot of dog for one household," she said flatly. Mason felt his jaw set. "They're family." Marla's mouth twitched. "Family doesn't exempt you from safety regulations." Inside, Evan watched her shoes cross the threshold. His fingers curled into the fabric of the nearest dog's collar. The dog leaned back into him, solid and sure. Marla noticed that, too. "Children and working dogs don't mix," she said, "especially not when the child is vulnerable." Ruth stepped forward, voice trembling but firm. "My grandson is not a risk." "No," Marla said, eyes never leaving Evan, "but the dogs might be." The word might landed harder than any accusation. Mason's voice rose despite himself. "They saved lives. They've worked more hours than most people in this town." Marla finally looked at him. "And now they're retired, which means they belong somewhere appropriate." Evan moved then. Slowly, carefully, he bent and picked up one of the collars from the basket by the door. Then another. He placed them in a straight line on the rug, just as he had before. His hands shook, but he didn't stop. One of the dogs whimpered, a sound so small it barely existed. Marla frowned. "What's he doing?" Ruth swallowed. "He's asking you not to take them." Marla's expression didn't soften. "We'll proceed with the inspection." The clipboard came out. Boxes were checked. Dates were set. By the time they left, the house felt scraped raw. That night, the furnace coughed and went quiet. Mason cursed under his breath and grabbed a flashlight. The basement smelled of cold metal and old dust. He knelt, tapped, adjusted. Nothing. When he came back upstairs, his breath steamed in the hallway. Ruth sat bundled in a blanket, lips pale. Evan stood in front of her, eyes wide, taking in the chill, the shiver in her hands, the dogs pressing closer. Something shifted in him then. Not fear, understanding. He turned and walked toward the back door. One of the dogs blocked him gently. Evan stepped around. Another followed. By the time he reached for the handle, all 7 were on their feet. Mason's voice cut through the cold. "Evan, where are you going, buddy?" Evan didn't answer. He pulled the door open. Snow rushed in, sharp and bright under the porch light. Evan stepped out barefoot, the whistle cord still looped around his wrist. The dogs hesitated only a second before following, bodies low, alert. Mason lunged forward, heart hammering. "Evan!" The boy kept walking, small footprints filling with snow behind him. And somewhere deep in the night, the wind began to rise. The cold hit Evan like a slap. Snow burned his feet, sharp and immediate, but he kept moving. The porch light threw a small circle of yellow behind him, shrinking with every step, until the dark swallowed it whole. Mason burst outside without his coat, Ruth's voice breaking behind him. "Mason, don't—" He didn't hear the rest. All he saw were Evan's footprints, too small, already softening at the edges as the wind swept snow back into them. 7 sets of larger prints formed around the boy's trail, not chaotic, not frantic. Organized. "Dana!" Mason shouted into his phone with shaking hands. "He's gone. Evan's gone." The wind rose fast, howling down from the trees like something alive. Snow lifted off the ground in sheets, blinding and disorienting. Within minutes, the world shrank to 10 feet in any direction. Officer Dana Brooks arrived with lights flashing, tires crunching through ice. She took one look at the tracks and swore under her breath. "This is bad," she said, but her voice stayed steady. "We'll find him." Neighbors came out with flashlights and coats pulled over pajamas. Someone brought a thermos. Someone else brought rope. But the trail vanished past the tree line, swallowed by drifts and shadow. Dana crouched near the last clear footprint, touching the snow. "He's headed toward the creek," she said. "There's a drop-off out there." Mason's stomach fell. "He won't make it in this." Behind them, the dogs stood at the edge of the yard, bodies angled toward the forest, ears forward. The oldest one gave a low sound, not a bark, not a whine, a signal. Dana looked at them, then at Mason. Did anyone give them a command? No, Mason said. They just know. The dog moved first, not running, purposeful. 2 others followed, splitting left and right, noses down. One stayed close to Mason, teeth catching the edge of his sleeve, tugging once before releasing and moving ahead. Dana's eyes widened. "They're forming," she said, "like a search team." She hit the button on her body cam. They pushed into the trees, branches snapping back against faces and coats. The wind howled louder here, funneling through the ravine. Snow fell heavier, thicker, erasing the past with every second. Mason stumbled once and went to a knee. Before he could stand, a shepherd pressed against him, steadying him with a solid flank. Mason grabbed the fur, breath coming ragged. "I've got you," he whispered, not sure who he was talking to anymore. A sharp bark cut through the storm. Another answered from farther downslope. Dana raised her head. "They've got something." The ground dropped away suddenly. A narrow cut in the land, hidden by snow. The creek ran beneath a crust of ice, black water moving fast below. Evan lay near the edge, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him, his small body half buried in drifted snow. His eyes were open, unfocused. The whistle cord lay slack across his chest. "Evan!" Mason lunged forward, but Dana grabbed his arm. "Careful!" The ice cracked underfoot. One of the dogs slid down first, placing himself between Evan and the drop, body braced. Another lay across Evan's legs, warmth immediate, fur already frosting over. 2 more began clawing at the snow around his trapped arm, fast but careful, as if they'd done this 100 times before. Evan's lips were blue, his breaths came shallow, barely there. Dana dropped to her knees, shouting instructions into her radio. "We've got a juvenile hypothermic, possible fracture. Need medics now." The oldest shepherd nudged Evan's face gently, then pressed his muzzle to the boy's cheek. Evan's eyelids fluttered. For a second, his gaze found the dog's eyes. His mouth opened. No sound came. The dogs worked without panic. One stayed pressed against Evan's chest, sharing heat. Another took Mason's pant leg in his teeth and pulled, guiding him to a safer angle. Mason followed, hand shaking, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Together, they freed Evan's arm. Mason scooped him up, feeling how light he was, how cold. Evan sagged against him, breath a thin ghost against Mason's neck. As they turned back, the wind screamed louder, furious now, as if angry they were taking something from it. Lights appeared through the trees, shouts, hands reached out. As they passed the tree line, something slipped from Evan's coat and fell into the snow with a dull clink. Mason stopped, staring. The whistle. Dana picked it up, brushing snow away. She looked at Evan's face, then at the dark forest behind them. "He wasn't running away," she said quietly. Mason swallowed, understanding crashing into him all at once. He was trying to go back. The storm raged on, but Evan was alive, and 7 dogs walked beside them, heads high, as if the mission was not yet finished. Evan woke to the sound of machines breathing for him. The room was dim, curtains half drawn against the snow, glare outside. A monitor ticked and hummed with quiet authority. His arm lay wrapped in a splint, bandaged from wrist to elbow, and an IV tugged lightly at the back of his hand. The cold was gone, replaced by a deep, aching warmth that settled into his bones like exhaustion after a long walk. For a moment, he didn't remember why he was there. Then he saw them. 7 shapes lay scattered across the hospital room floor and hallway beyond, bodies tucked neatly out of the way, heads up, eyes fixed on him. A nurse stood frozen near the door, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "They won't move," she whispered to Mason. "They just Won't leave him. Mason sat beside the bed, shoulders slumped, eyes red and rimmed with days he hadn't slept. When Evan's gaze met his, Mason leaned forward so fast his chair scraped. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "Easy? You're safe?" Evan's eyes drifted back to the dogs. One of them thumped his tail once against the linoleum. Another stood and stepped closer, stopping just short of the bed, waiting. Dana Brooks stood near the window, arms folded, watching it all with a look she hadn't managed to shake since the ravine. Her body camera sat on the counter, powered down, but very much not forgotten. The doctor came in mid-morning, silver-haired and careful with his words. Hypothermia, mild concussion, a fractured wrist. More than that, he added, lowering his voice, this boy experienced an acute trauma response. Whatever you do, don't separate him from what grounds him. Mason didn't need to ask what that meant. By noon, the video was already spreading. It started with a neighbor's shaky phone footage, flashing lights, wind screaming, 7 dogs cutting through snow like they owned it. Then Dana's body cam, clearer, steadier. Dogs forming, splitting, signaling, one lying across Evan's legs, another digging, another guiding a grown man through a whiteout like it was nothing. Someone added music, someone else added captions. By evening, it was everywhere. Retired K-9s save missing boy in blizzard. Donations poured in before anyone asked for them. Blankets, coats, toys, a generator. A check slipped under the hospital room door with a note that just said, "For the dogs. Keep them together." But not everyone was moved. By the second day, the comments changed. They're dangerous. 7 dogs in one house with a child? Irresponsible. Military dogs are unstable. Animal control called Mason in the hallway, voice stiff, rehearsed. The incident doesn't change protocol. In fact, it raises concerns. Mason closed his eyes. They saved him. That's not the issue, the voice replied. At the house, Grandma Ruth watched the furnace cycle back on thanks to a donated fuel delivery and felt no relief. She sat at the table and pressed a hand to her chest, heart fluttering like a trapped bird. Every ring of the phone made her flinch. Marla Hensley watched the footage alone in her living room, volume low. She paused it again and again on one frame. A dog's tag caught the light just long enough to show a name she hadn't expected to see. Her fingers trembled as she rewound. At the hospital, Evan slept and woke in quiet pieces. Each time he opened his eyes, the dogs were there. Each time a nurse tried to usher them out, one look from Dana stopped the attempt. On the third night, Evan stirred and reached for something that wasn't there. Dana noticed first. She stepped forward and placed the whistle in his palm, metal cool and familiar. Evan's fingers curled around it immediately. He didn't blow it. He just held it. Outside the room, Mason leaned against the wall and slid down until he was sitting on the floor, head in his hands. He had fought fires, handled attack dogs, faced men twice his size. He had never been this afraid. Inside, 7 dogs lay in patient silence, guarding a boy who had walked into a storm for love. And across town, decisions were being made that would test whether loyalty counted for anything at all. The hospital room became a strange kind of sanctuary. People lowered their voices when they stepped inside, as if grief and loyalty were things that could be startled. Evan remained quiet, but he was no longer empty. His eyes followed the dogs when they shifted positions. His hand tightened around the whistle whenever someone new entered, then loosened again when he saw familiar faces. The attention arrived faster than anyone could manage it. A local reporter waited in the hallway with a cameraman. A radio station called twice before noon. Donations stacked up in the nurse's station, boxes labeled with careful handwriting. Dana Brooks intercepted most of it, redirecting calls, shaking her head at microphones. "Not today," she said. "He's a child." But the internet didn't know how to wait. By the second evening, the comments had split clean down the middle. Half the country seemed to be crying with them. The other half had opinions sharp enough to cut. 7 dogs in a home with a traumatized child. Retired canines are unpredictable. Hero stories don't erase liability. Animal Control sent an official notice to the hospital. The paper shook in Mason's hand as he read it. An expedited inspection. A temporary order. If compliance could not be demonstrated immediately, the dogs would be removed for the child's safety. Mason laughed once, a short, broken sound. They're the only reason he's alive. The caseworker on the phone paused. That's not how the guidelines work. At home, Grandma Ruth tried to keep the house ready, just in case. She washed blankets, folded donated sweaters, stacked dog food along the wall. Her chest hurt in a way she didn't want to name. She told herself it was the cold. She told herself it would pass. Marla Hensley watched the footage again that night, slower this time. She leaned in close to the screen, eyes narrowing at the dog tag swinging against thick fur. One name tugged at her memory, old and stubborn. She went to a filing cabinet she hadn't opened in years and pulled out a thin folder marked with a date she would never forget. Inside was a photograph of a younger version of herself, kneeling in snow, arms wrapped around a shaking teenage boy. Beside them stood a German shepherd, alert and proud, a hand-painted canine patch stitched to his vest. The name on the tag matched the one on the screen. Her throat tightened. Back at the hospital, Evan slept and woke in fragments. On the third night, nurse tried once more to usher the dogs into the hallway. Evan's eyes flew open, his breathing quickened, shallow and fast. Before anyone could speak, the oldest shepherd stood and placed himself between Evan and the door, not growling, not threatening, just there. The nurse stepped back, shaken. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Dana nodded. "We all are." The next morning, the call came while Mason was helping Evan sit up. The dogs lifted their heads in unison at the sound of Mason's phone vibrating. He listened, face draining of color, then lowered himself into the chair as if his legs had finally given up. "They're coming tomorrow," he said to Dana. "They're taking at least 3. Evan watched his mouth move. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the weight behind them. His fingers clenched hard around the whistle, metal biting into his palm. Dana felt something shift inside her. She had followed rules her whole career. Rules kept people alive. But rules didn't always tell the truth. "I might have something," she said slowly. "An exception. For retired K-9 units. It's rare. It'll take proof and support." Mason looked up, hope flickering. "We have proof." Dana nodded. "Then we'll need voices." Across town, Marla Hensley stood at her desk with the old photograph in her hands. She thought of a night long ago when a dog had pulled her son from a ravine and waited until help arrived. She thought of the way she had promised herself she would never forget. She picked up her phone. At the hospital, Evan shifted, gaze drifting from one dog to the next. He lifted the whistle to his lips again, breath trembling. No sound came, but this time he didn't look disappointed. He looked determined. The meeting room at Cedar Ridge Town Hall smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. Folding chairs scraped softly against the floor as people settled in, coats still on, boots damp from melting snow. The agenda was short. The tension was not. Marla Hensley sat at the front table, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. In her bag rested the old photograph, edges worn thin. She hadn't planned to bring it. It had followed her out the door anyway. Officer Dana Brooks stood near the wall, arms crossed, watching the room fill. She recognized faces from the search, neighbors who had held flashlights in the storm, a man who had lent rope, a woman who had brought soup to the hospital and left it without a name. Mason arrived last, shoulders tight, jaw set. He looked older than he had a week ago. Grandma Ruth hadn't been cleared to come. Her heart had fluttered again that morning, just enough to scare the doctor. Mason carried that fear with him like a weight in his chest. Animal control presented first. Procedures, liability, risk assessments. Words that sounded clean and reasonable when you didn't picture a 6-year-old in a hospital bed gripping a whistle with bleeding hands. Then Dana stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She played the footage. The room went quiet as the screen filled with white chaos and flashing lights. 7 dogs moved through the storm with purpose that needed no explanation. When the image froze on Evan's small body half buried in snow, someone near the back covered their mouth. "These dogs," Dana said, "are retired K-9 search and rescue. They acted without command. They coordinated. They saved a child. Separating them now would not be an act of safety. It would be an act of harm." Murmurs rippled through the room. Marla stood. Every sound seemed to stop. She reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph. She held it up, hands steady now. 15 years ago, she said, voice low. My son went missing during a winter hike. He was found alive because of a K-9 unit. One of those dogs is in this photograph. She turned the photo so the council could see the name on the tag. It's the same dog. A collective breath moved through the room. I forgot, Marla continued. I forgot what it felt like to owe your child's life to an animal. I forgot what loyalty looks like when it doesn't come in words. She looked directly at Mason. I was wrong. The vote passed quickly after that. A temporary exception became a permanent one. 7 dogs, 1 home, together. Dana closed her eyes for a moment, relief washing through her. At the hospital, Grandma Ruth felt it before she heard it. The tightness in her chest eased. When Mason called, she cried into the receiver, quiet and grateful. That night, Evan sat up in bed, the dogs arranged around him like a living wall. He listened as Mason told him the story slowly, carefully, not rushing a single word. Evan didn't speak, but when Mason finished, Evan reached out and touched each dog in turn, as if counting something important. Outside the room, a nurse watched with tears in her eyes. Inside, something fragile and new was taking shape, waiting for its moment to be heard. Evan came home on a quiet afternoon, the kind that felt borrowed. The snow had stopped, leaving the world clean and pale. Every sound softened, as if someone had laid a blanket over the town. Grandma Ruth waited on the porch, with a scarf pulled tight, and tears she didn't bother hiding. Uncle Mason carried Evan inside, careful of the healing wrist, careful of everything now. The dogs entered last, one by one, pausing at the threshold as if asking permission. When Evan nodded, barely a movement, they crossed and spread through the house, reclaiming their old places. The furnace hummed, steady and warm. The donated generator sat ready in the corner. Food lined the wall. For the first time in weeks, the house felt like it might hold together. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. He sat on the floor of his room with his back against the bed, the whistle resting in his palm. Moonlight slid through the window and pooled on the carpet. The dogs gathered without instruction, forming a loose circle that left him space to breathe. No one rushed him. No one waited with expectations. Grandma Ruth watched from the hallway, heart full and fragile. Mason stood behind her, hands clasped tight, afraid that if he moved, he might break whatever delicate balance had settled over them. Evan lifted the whistle to his lips. He inhaled. The breath trembled. He tried again, slower. The metal touched his mouth, cold and familiar. His eyes flicked from one dog to the next, as if checking that they were still there, that they hadn't vanished with the storm. A sound came out. It wasn't a clear note. It wasn't loud. It was uneven and small, but it was real. Every dog reacted at once. Heads snapped up, ears tilted forward, tails moved, cautious and hopeful, like they were afraid to scare the sound away. Evan lowered the whistle, surprised by himself. His chest rose and fell quickly. He swallowed, face tight with effort. He reached out and touched the oldest dog first, fingers sinking into thick fur. His lips moved. "Shadow," he whispered. The name cracked in the air like ice breaking. Grandma Ruth gasped and clutched the doorframe. Mason's knees went weak, and he sat down hard on the floor, hands over his mouth, tears streaming freely now. Evan turned to the next dog. His voice came out a little stronger. "Bear," then another. "Luna." The sounds were imperfect, shaped by months of silence, but they were unmistakably his. When he finished, he sat very still, as if listening to himself breathe. Mason crawled forward on his knees, stopping a few feet away. "Buddy," he said softly, afraid to ask too much. "It's okay. You don't have to." Evan shook his head. He looked up at Mason, eyes clear and steady in a way they hadn't been since the night of the storm. His hand tightened around the whistle one last time, then relaxed. "They found me," he said. The words settled into the room, heavy and gentle all at once. Mason understood. It wasn't just about the ravine, or the storm, or the night Evan walked out into the dark carrying guilt too big for a child to name. It was everything after, the way the world had gone quiet, the way he had disappeared inside himself. 7 dogs had gone in after him. Grandma Ruth crossed the room and knelt, pulling Evan into her arms, careful of the cast, careful of the miracle. Evan held on, breathing her in, grounding himself in something solid and alive. The dogs pressed closer, a living wall of warmth and watchful eyes. In the days that followed, life didn't turn perfect. Grief didn't vanish. Some nights Evan still woke shaking. Some mornings words came slowly, like a path being cleared one careful step at a time. But the house filled with sound again. Soft words, laughter that surprised everyone when it arrived, the low thump of tails against walls, the steady rhythm of breath and presence. On a bright morning not long after, Evan opened the front door by himself. He stood on the porch with the whistle around his neck. The 7 dogs sat in a line, waiting. Evan lifted the whistle and blew. This time the note rang clear, and together they moved forward, not as a rescue team, not as a miracle story, but as a family that had found its way back from the silence. If this story touched your heart, don't scroll away just yet. Sometimes the hardest pain isn't loud. Sometimes healing doesn't come from words. Sometimes loyalty speaks when people can't. If you believe that love can still find us, even in silence, leave a 1 in the comments. If you believe animals can save us when we're lost, leave a 0. It only takes a second, but it tells us you were here, and that this story mattered to you. And if you'd like to hear more quiet, true stories of courage, loyalty, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel. New stories are coming, and the next one might stay with you longer than you expect.